cabin on Graybeale Ridge had been boarded shut for as long as anyone under 50 could remember. It sat at the end of a path that Ezra Graybeale mowed but never walked. 3 generations of Graybeales had grown up within sight of it, had been told not to go near it, and had obeyed. Mostly. Children tested the boards. The boards held. The cabin became a feature of the landscape, like a boulder or a dead tree, always there, never explained, eventually invisible. Then, in October 1905, Ezra's mother, Parthenia Graybeale, died at the age of 79. She was the last person alive who knew why the cabin was sealed. On her deathbed, she told Ezra one sentence: "Your grandfather is not in the grave we visit. Open the cabin, and you will understand." Ezra waited until after the funeral. Then he got a crowbar. He stood at the bottom of the path on a gray November morning, the crowbar resting across his shoulder, and looked up at the structure he had avoided for the better part of his 41 years. He was a practical man, a farmer, a reader, a deacon at the Methodist Church on Smith Creek Road, and he was not given to superstition. But standing there, he felt something that he would later describe in a letter to his daughter as a weight on the chest that was not grief and not fear, but something older than either. The ridge was quiet. The new river ran somewhere below, out of sight, but audible on certain mornings when the wind came from the south. The oldest river in North America, murmuring over stones it had been moving for millions of years, longer than the mountains that flanked it. Up here on the ridge, the air had the particular quality of November in the North Carolina high country, thin and cold, and carrying the smell of wet oak leaves and wood smoke from the farmhouse below, where Ezra's wife and children were going about the morning without him. He walked up the path. The cabin was built of chestnut logs, the same material as every other structure on Graybeale land, cut from the vast forests that still covered the ridges in those years, before the blight took them. Someone, his mother, he assumed, or whoever she had trusted with the task, had replaced the boards across the windows and door at intervals over the decades, as the original lumber grayed and cracked. The newest boards were perhaps 10 years old. They had been nailed with iron nails and sealed at the edges with some kind of pitch or tar. The same careful attention to sealing that had preserved whatever was inside across 4 decades of mountain weather. Whoever maintained this cabin had wanted it to stay shut. They had also wanted it to stay whole. Ezra looked at the boards for a long moment. Then he set the crowbar against the doorframe and began to pry. The nails came out with the sound that old nails always make. A groan, a squeal, a pop that echoed off the ridge face and scattered a group of juncos from a rhododendron 10 feet away. The boards came off one at a time, dropping into the dead grass at his feet. He worked methodically, the way he did everything, pulling each nail free before moving to the next board, setting the boards in a stack to one side. It took him perhaps 20 minutes to clear the door. When the last board came away, he stood back and looked at the door itself. A heavy plank door hung on hand-forged hinges, the wood still sound, the latch a simple iron bar resting in its bracket. He lifted the bar. The door swung inward on hinges that had not moved in 40 years, and the sound it made was not a creak, but something lower and more complicated, a sound like a long exhale. And the air that came out of the darkness inside was something Ezra Graybeale was not prepared for. It was not the smell of rot or decay that he had braced himself against. It was the smell of a room that had simply been very, very still. Dry wood, old cloth, the faint ghost of wood smoke from a fire not built in 4 decades, and something else beneath it, something he could not name but would think about for years afterward, the particular mineral scent of preserved time, of air sealed in a space that had not breathed since the last man to breathe. It walked out and disappeared from history. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness before stepping inside. The main room of the cabin was not large, perhaps 16 by 18 feet, the dimensions of a man alone who needed space to work and sleep and nothing more. The windows were boarded from the inside, just as Parthenia had always kept the exterior boards replaced, so the only light entered now through the open door behind Ezra, cutting a rectangle of pale November gray across a plank floor. He could see, in that gray light, the outline of a table, a chair, a shelf along the far wall, and on the shelf, shapes he could not yet make out. He went back to the farmhouse and returned with a lantern. In the lantern light, the room assembled itself around him like a sentence being read slowly, word by word. The table was simple, 4 boards on trestle legs, but the workmanship was good, the joints tight, the surface planned smooth. On it sat a plate and a tin cup. The plate had held food once. Now it held 40 years of dust, the original substance long since gone to nothing, leaving only a faint dark stain that might have been beans, or might have been bread, or might have been the last meal of a man who thought he might come back and did not. The cup was upright. Ezra looked at it for a long time without touching it. There was something unbearable about the cup's uprightness, the optimism encoded in setting something down as though you intended to pick it up again. The chair sat facing the boarded window that would have looked east, toward the sunrise, toward the New River Valley. It was a Windsor-style chair, and something about it stopped Ezra cold. He knew enough about furniture to know that the chair he was looking at was not the work of an amateur. The spindles were turned with a precision that suggested a lathe of some kind, and the crest rail, the curved piece across the top of the back, was carved with a pattern of interlocking leaves that was purely decorative, serving no structural purpose at all. Someone had sat in this chair and looked at the boarded window that blocked his view of the morning, and while sitting there, had made something beautiful. The shelf held books. Ezra counted 7 of them, pulling the lantern close to read the spines. A Bible, its cover swollen slightly from some long-ago humidity before the cabin was fully sealed. A volume of Shakespeare's plays, the complete works. A substantial book, its spine faded to illegibility, but the title just readable on the cover. An agricultural almanac from 1861, the year the war began. A copy of Ralph Waldo Emerson's Essays, first series, the binding intact, the pages yellowed but unwarped. A medical handbook. A volume Ezra recognized as a general history of North Carolina. And one more book, smaller than the others, its cover plain boards without a title. He reached for the plain book last. It was not a book. It was a journal. A composition book of the kind sold at dry goods stores. The pages filled from cover to cover in a handwriting that Ezra recognized immediately, because he had seen it on documents in the family Bible. On the deed to the land his father had inherited from his grandfather. on a letter kept in a box in his mother's room for as long as he could remember. The handwriting of Phineas Graybeale, his grandfather, killed in the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863 at the age of 32. Except that his grandfather had not died at Chickamauga. His grandfather had come home. Ezra carried the journal to the table, set it beside the plate with its 40-year-old dust, and sat down in the chair that faced the boarded window. The lantern threw a yellow circle of light on the open pages. He adjusted his spectacles, and he began to read. The first entry was dated November 14th, 1863. I have come home. This is not the right word for what I have done, which is to desert. I will use the right words throughout this account, because I believe in precision of language, even when the language indicts me. I deserted the Army of Tennessee on November the 9th, on the road between Dalton and Ringgold, Georgia, in the confusion that followed the Army's retreat from Missionary Ridge. I walked away from the column when the column broke in the darkness, and I walked north, and I walked for 5 days, and I am now in the cabin on the upper ridge of the land my father left me. I have told no one I am here. I have asked my wife, by letter left in the rock crevice we established for this purpose when we were courting, to tell no one. She has not yet responded. I do not know if she has received the letter. I am aware that what I have asked of her may be more than a man has a right to ask. I am aware of many things I was not aware of a month ago. I will try to write them down, because a man who does not examine himself is a man who will repeat himself, and I mean to examine this thoroughly. Ezra read that paragraph 3 times. He sat in the sealed room with the lantern light on the page and the November cold pressing through the walls, and read it 3 times, and something happened in his chest that he could not fully account for. Not shock, exactly, because his mother's dying words had prepared him for something, if not for this. Not shame, though he was aware that shame was somewhere in the room with him, waiting to be claimed. What he felt, reading those words for the 3rd time, was something closer to recognition. He had known Phineas Graybeale only as a name on a grave marker, as a face in a daguerreotype, as the absence that had shaped his mother's life and therefore his. But this voice, precise, self-critical, unsparing, felt familiar in a way that made the back of his neck prickle. It felt like his own voice, written down 40 years before he had learned to write it. He kept reading. November 17th, 1863. Parthenia has responded. She came to the cabin last night, at some hour after midnight. I heard her footsteps on the path and nearly fired before I recognized the pattern of her walk. A thing I know the way I know my own breathing. She knocked 3 times, the way we agreed upon in the letter. I opened the door. We stood looking at each other across the threshold for a long moment. I am told I have changed since I left in the autumn of 1862. I believe it, because she looked at me as though she were confirming the identity of someone she was not certain was the person she expected. Then she came in. She stayed 3 hours. She told me what she will tell the community. She told me what has been said of my absence. That I was seen in the fighting near Missionary Ridge. That my company suffered heavily. That several men were not accounted for in the immediate aftermath. She will not contradict this. She will say only that I have been reported among the missing, and that she fears the worst. In time, She will say she believes me dead. She did not ask me if I was willing to be dead. She understood that I already was. He would read those words aloud to his wife that evening. Ezra would, standing at the kitchen table with the journal in his hands while supper cooled in the pot. His wife, a woman named Clara, who had grown up in Ashe County and knew its silences as well as anyone, would listen without speaking, and then say, she was protecting him. And Ezra would say yes, and then he would say, she was protecting him for 40 years. And Clara would be quiet for a moment before saying, some things take that long to stop needing protection. But that was the evening. In the moment, Ezra sat alone in the sealed room and read. The diary settled into a rhythm after those first entries, Phineas writing every few days, sometimes every day when something pressed him, sometimes skipping a week when, as he noted once, there is nothing new to say about silence except that it continues. The early weeks in the cabin were, by his own account, the hardest. He had been a sociable man before the war, a farmer who attended church and community meetings, who traded conversation as freely as he traded goods, who had married young and happily and built his life around the daily practice of not being alone. The sudden and total solitude of the sealed cabin, no voices, no company, the windows boarded against the chance of a passerby seeing a light and wondering, was a kind of violence to his nature. November 28th, 1863. I have spoken aloud 6 times today, and each time the sound of my own voice startled me, as though someone unexpected had entered the room. This is what it is to be dead. A man speaks only to himself, and even then he has forgotten the sound. December 4th, 1863. The wind has been extraordinary for 3 days, a north wind off the ridge that finds every gap in the chinking and makes the cabin sound like a living thing, all creaks and sighs and small percussions. I find I am grateful for it. If the cabin makes noise, I am not the only sound in it. December 12th, 1863. Parthenia came again. She brought flour, salt pork, dried beans, and a candle. She also brought news. My name has appeared in a list of the missing published in the Watauga Democrat. She has begun, with what she describes as careful sorrow, to speak of me in the past tense. She says the community has been kind. Several men from the church came to help with the autumn harvest, as is the custom when a widow's family is in difficulty. She did not correct them when they called her a widow. I asked her how she bore it. She said, I bear it the way I bear the cold. I remind myself it is temporary, and I dress for it. I have always admired her practical intelligence. I find I admire it more from this distance. The cold. It was a recurring presence in the early diary entries, and reading them in November, Ezra felt it sympathetically, the particular cold of an Appalachian ridgeline in winter, the kind of cold that gets into the boards of a cabin and into the bones of the man inside it, that makes a small fire feel like the most essential and precious thing in the world. Phineas describes, over the course of December and January, the construction of a better firebox from stones he pried from the ridge face behind the cabin, a project that occupied him for 3 weeks and produced something that heated the room more efficiently than the original hearth. He describes the cutting and splitting of wood from a stand of dead chestnut 30 yards from the cabin, working in the gray pre-dawn hours when no one would see the axe swinging, carrying the splits inside and stacking them with mathematical precision against the back wall. He describes, in an entry from January 1864, the moment when the isolation stopped feeling like punishment and began feeling like something else. January 19th, 1864. I have been inside this cabin for 67 days. I am aware of this because I have kept a count on the wall behind the woodpile, a prisoner's count, a line for each day, grouped in fives like the bars of a jail window. I looked at them this morning and felt something shift. Not acceptance, exactly. Not peace. Something more like the recognition that this is my life now. Not a suspension of life, but the thing itself. 67 days ago, I would have told you that a life without other people in it was not a life worth living. I begin to believe I was wrong, or at least that I was confusing the desire for company with something more fundamental, the desire to be known. A man can be known by no one and still know himself. I am testing this theory. The results are not yet conclusive. Ezra set the journal down on the table and looked at the rifle above the door. He had noticed it when he first came in, and now he examined it more carefully. It was a percussion cap rifle, a good one, an Enfield pattern piece that would have been military issue in 1862, and Phineas had presumably kept it when he deserted. It hung on 2 wooden pegs above the door frame, and even from across the room, Ezra could see that it had been maintained. The metal showed no rust. The stock was oiled. Someone, Phineas presumably, in the long, careful years of his hiding, had kept it clean and ready. Whether from habit or prudence, or the particular anxiety of a man who knew that being found would be a death sentence, Ezra could not say. But the rifle had been cared for the way a man cares for a tool he expects to need someday, and the fact that it was still here, still loaded as Ezra confirmed by checking the powder charge, meant that Phineas had walked out of this cabin on his last morning without it, which said something, though Ezra was not yet sure what. A man who walks out without his rifle either does not expect to need it, or has decided not to use it. Given what Phineas had written about his departure, words Ezra would not read until later that morning, both interpretations carried weight. He turned back to the shelf of books. The Emerson caught his eye, and he pulled it down. The pages were annotated, not heavily, not a scholar's thick marginalia, but with occasional pencil marks. A line underscored here, a word circled there, and in a few places a note in the margin in Phineas's neat hand. On the page containing the essay, Self-Reliance, someone had drawn a single vertical line beside the following passage: Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. And in the margin, in pencil that had faded, but was still legible, 3 words: He knows us. Ezra stood with the book in one hand and the lantern in the other, and for a moment the cabin was very quiet around him, the way a cabin is quiet when it has been sealed for 40 years, and the man it was sealed around is finally the subject of someone else's reading. He thought about his mother, who had slept within a quarter-mile of this room for 60 years and carried its secret inside her like a stone in water. Something you know is there from the weight of it, but cannot touch directly, cannot lift, cannot put down. He thought about what it had cost her. He thought about what it must have cost her to say, finally, at the end, the one sentence that would open the door. He thought about what she had been protecting across all those years by keeping it shut. He thought, she was protecting him, And then he thought, no, she was protecting something more complicated than him. She was protecting the fact that he had chosen this, chosen desertion, chosen hiding, chosen the sealed room over the marching column, and that his choice had been a real choice, made by a real man for reasons he had written down carefully in a journal she had presumably read. She was protecting not his life, but his meaning. The difference was subtle and total. He set the Emerson back on the shelf and turned to the room behind the main space. A door he had not noticed at first, half hidden by the angle of the wall, leading into what turned out to be a larger space than he expected. He lifted the lantern and stepped through. The workshop stopped him the way the chair had stopped him. Not with surprise exactly, but with something that had the force of surprise, because what he saw in the back room of the cabin on Graybeale Ridge was not the rough work of a man killing time in hiding. It was an exhibition, a lifetime of craft compressed into 2 years of solitude, and, by what measure Ezra could apply, refined to a quality he had not expected to find on a ridgeline in Ashe County, North Carolina, in a room that had been sealed since before the Civil War ended. The workshop occupied the full back half of the cabin structure. 2 rooms, as Ezra now realized the building had always been, though the connecting door had been added by Phineas himself, the framing work still visible where he had cut through the original log wall with more precision than strictly necessary, the edges of the opening planed smooth, and the corners squared to a degree that the original builders had not attempted. Against the far wall stood a workbench of serious proportions, 8 feet long, 2 feet deep, the surface scarred with the marks of 40 years of projects, but clean beneath the dust, the wood dense and close-grained from Phineas's application of linseed oil. Above the bench, pegs held tools, chisels in graduated sizes, gouges, a mallet, a draw knife, 2 marking gauges, a set of hand planes of different profiles, and items that Ezra could not immediately name. Things that Phineas had apparently made himself to accomplish tasks for which no standard tool existed. In the corner, mounted to a heavy post sunk directly into the earthen floor of the workshop, was a pole lathe, a simple, ancient machine, the kind that a man in the mountains might build from materials at hand. The springy pole above was a length of young ash, bent by years of use into a permanent slight curve. The treadle below was foot-worn wood. The spindle between them was iron, precisely made, hand-forged presumably from whatever metal Phineas had access to, or had smuggled in with Parthenia's supply deliveries. That he had built a lathe in a sealed room was remarkable. That the lathe was still functional, Ezra discovered by pressing on the treadle, was more remarkable still. The furniture first drew his eye because there was so much of it. Not all of it still stood in the workshop. Some pieces had been moved to the main room, which now made more sense. The chair Ezra had sat in to read the diary, the table itself, were workshop products, not brought from the farmhouse. But the remaining pieces in the workshop were more complex. A small cabinet with 2 drawers, the drawer faces carved with an overlapping geometric pattern that repeated itself in a way Ezra found almost hypnotic. A design element he recognized from neither local tradition nor anything he had seen in his reading, but which seemed to have come from nowhere, except from a man left alone, long enough to develop his own aesthetic. A rocking chair that was visibly different from the Windsor chair in the main room, Lower, with a broader seat, the rockers shaped in a curve that Ezra tested by sitting down and found to be unlike any rocking motion he had experienced before, smoother and slower, as though Phineas had calculated the arc geometrically rather than copying a received form. And the carvings, they were everywhere in the workshop, on the windowsill, boarded like the front windows from inside, arranged in a loose row, on a shelf above the lathe, in a wooden box on the floor beside the workbench, stacked 2 and 3 deep, as though stored rather than displayed, some small as a fist, some larger, all made from local woods. He could identify chestnut, walnut, cherry, and a pale wood he thought might be sycamore. Animals predominated, a deer in full leap. The forelegs extended in a pose that captured motion with a quality he had seen in magazine illustrations, but not in hand carving. A bear sitting upright, contemplating something invisible to its left, with an expression of what Ezra could only describe as worried dignity. A fox, mouth slightly open, carved with such attention to the texture of fur that Ezra ran his thumb across it twice before accepting that what he was touching was wood. There were faces among the carvings, human faces, or faces that approached the human, some abstract enough to be ambiguous. A hollowed oval that might have been eyes and nose, might have been landscape, might have been something else entirely that had no name. Others more specific. A face he could not place, a broad-featured face with deep-set eyes and an expression of what he thought was patience. An old woman's face, deeply lined, with a quality of authority that made it feel like a portrait, though of whom he could not say. And one face, smaller than the others, carved in pale sycamore wood, that he set aside without looking at closely. Not because anything was wrong with it, but because something was very right, and he wanted to read more diary before he trusted himself to look at it clearly. He went back to the main room and the journal. The diary's middle section, the entries from spring through autumn of 1864, was a different document from the winter entries that preceded it. The anxiety of the early months was still present, but had been, as Phineas described it himself in an April entry, moved to the back of the room, where it sits in a chair of its own and does not speak unless addressed. What replaced it was not happiness exactly, and not peace, but something that reads across the decades as close to both. A man who has found his work and found, in the finding, the version of himself that was always there, but had not previously had the conditions to emerge. April 3rd, 1864. I have been completing the cabinet, the one with the geometric faces on the drawers. I have been working on it since February, and it is now, as of this morning, done. I do not mean done in the way I previously meant done, which was to say that a thing functioned as intended and required no further attention. I mean done in the way that a sentence is done, when every word is the right word and no other arrangement would be better. I have made furniture before. I made the table in the farmhouse kitchen, the bedstead, the press for the parlor. I was competent. I was not, I now understand, paying attention. The cabinet taught me to pay attention. 2 years of no competing demands, no field to tend, no market to bring product to, no community expectation to meet. I have had nothing to do but work on the wood and look at what I was doing, and the looking has changed the doing, and the doing has changed the looking. I am not the craftsman I was when I came here. I am not sure. I am the man I was when I came here. He wrote about the carvings with particular intensity, more personally than he wrote about the furniture, as though the furniture was craft and the carvings were something else, something closer to speech. He had begun carving, he wrote, during the worst weeks of the previous winter, when the cold and the silence and the weight of what he had done pressed hardest, and the carving had been initially a way to do something with his hands that required no thought, a way to be occupied without being present, but the animals had surprised him. December 29th, 1863. I have been carving a deer, small, no longer than my hand, from a scrap of cherry that was not good enough for any structural purpose. I began it without intention. I was whittling more than carving, making cuts without a plan, seeing what the wood preferred to become. It became a deer. I did not decide this. The deer was there in the wood, and I found it. I am aware that this is the kind of thing a man says when he wants to avoid taking responsibility for his choices. I do not mean it that way. I mean only that the form was more present in the material than my own intention was, and following the material was not a failure of will, but a different kind of will. This is what I have been thinking about since I came to this cabin, and why I chose this, rather than the alternative. I followed the form that was already there. The war asked me to become something I was not. I declined. That passage, the last 2 sentences of it, made Ezra stop. He read them again. He had grown up in the aftermath of the war, in a county that had been divided by it, in a family that carried its mark, in ways that were spoken of, and ways that were not. He had grown up knowing, without knowing, that the landscape of Ashe County in 1865 was not what it had been in 1860, that something had been broken and imperfectly repaired, that the men who came home were not the same men who had left, and that the men who had not come home were absences with particular shapes that persisted in families and communities for generations. He had never thought in all his life about what it meant to have refused. He had thought about death. He had thought about wounds. He had thought, in the way a man who reads history thinks, about strategy and politics and the broad sweep of causes and consequences. He had not thought about the single moment when a man on a road in Georgia, in the dark and confusion of a retreating army, decides that the road does not go where he is willing to go, and turns around. He turned back to the workshop. The carvings, examined now with the context of what he had read, arranged themselves into a kind of narrative. He went through them slowly, picking up each one and turning it in the lamplight, and what he saw was a progression, not of skill alone, though the skill was clearly there, the early pieces rougher and the later ones more refined, but of inner weather. The early animals were tight. The deer he had read about in the December entry was wound with tension, every muscle defined, the eyes wide. A dog he found in the wooden box, which he guessed from its style was also from that first winter, was crouched and watchful, its body communicating a wariness so acute it bordered on fear. The man had been afraid when he made these, justifiably afraid. The penalty for desertion was death if caught, and the Union lines were not close, and the community around him believed him dead and would continue to believe it, and there was no one to protect him except his wife, bringing flour by night. But somewhere around the middle of the collection, He guessed from the quality of the work that the transitional pieces dated from spring or summer of 1864. The tension released. The animals became themselves rather than metaphors for their maker's state. A rabbit sitting up, alert but not alarmed, with the particular quality of attention that rabbits have, fully present, not afraid, just aware. A pair of foxes, one grooming the other, rendered with a tenderness toward the subject that was so different from the fearful dog of the first winter that it seemed like the work of a different person, or a different version of the same person, one who had passed through something and come out somewhere else. The faces told the same story in a different idiom. The abstract, hollowed oval faces from early in the sequence became, over time, more specific, more inhabited, as though Phineas was practicing personhood on the wood before reclaiming it for himself. The face of the old woman with the authority in her expression, which Ezra thought was probably from the Middle Period, had a quality of having been looked at until it revealed itself, the way a landscape does if you sit with it long enough. And the small sycamore face he had set aside, he picked it up now and held it close to the lamp and saw what he had half known he was going to see. It was Parthenia. Not Parthenia as she had been when she died, at 79, the woman Ezra knew as his mother, but Parthenia young. Parthenia as she would have been when Phineas Graybeale last saw her clearly in the years just before the war. He knew the face from the only photograph of her from that period, a daguerreotype that sat on the parlor mantel at the farmhouse, taken around 1860 when she was in her middle 30s. That specific architecture of cheekbone and jaw, the particular way her eyes sat in their sockets, the expression she wore in the photograph and wore in the carving, which was not quite a smile, and not quite gravity, but something combining both. The face of a woman who had decided to be exactly who she was and was comfortable with that decision. Phineas had carved his wife's face from memory in a sealed room from a piece of pale sycamore the size of his palm, and he had gotten it right. Ezra held the carving for a long time in the lamplight, long enough for the cold of the workshop to fully enter him, before he set it back on the shelf with the care he would give to something that belonged in a museum. Not because it was fragile, but because it was, he now understood, exactly that. A museum piece, an artifact, the physical record of a love conducted through a boarded door, in flour sacks and letters and night visits, and a face carved from pale wood in a room sealed against the world. He went back to the diary and read through the summer of 1864 standing at the table, because he was suddenly reluctant to sit in the chair that Phineas had sat in, as though occupying it for too long would displace something that belonged to its maker. The summer entries were the most purely pleasurable reading in the journal. Not because they were happy exactly, but because they were the entries of a man who had found his stride. Phineas had gotten good at being what he was, a hidden man, a dead man by the world's reckoning, a living man by his own, and a craftsman of a quality that the world would never see because the world thought he was a grave in the churchyard. There was an irony in this that he acknowledged directly. August 14th, 1864. I have finished the rocking chair. It is, by my own assessment, which I offer with the caveat that I have no competing work to measure against, the best thing I have made in my life, by which I mean, it is the closest I have come to making the thing I was trying to make, rather than a compromise with what was possible, given my skill at the time of making. I have made compromises in this chair too. The secondary curves of the rocker are not exactly what I intended, and there is a joint at the left arm that I will always know is not as tight as I wished. But these are craftsmen's complaints, not failures. The chair exists. It is what it intended to be. No one will see it. No one will sit in it except me. And I do not sit in it for very long at a time, because it is too comfortable. And comfort is dangerous when you are the only occupant of your own life, and there is no one to tell you it is time to stop sitting. I made it anyway. I made it with the same intention I would have brought to a chair made for the county fair, or a chair made for a man of consequence, or a chair made for a church. The chair deserved the intention, regardless of who would see it. This is something I did not previously understand about work. The war, in these middle diary entries, was a distant sound, a rumble from somewhere south and east that arrived in the form of news delivered by Parthenia on her visits, or in the form of men who came through the county on their way to somewhere else, or in the form of absences that accumulated in the community as more men did not return from the armies. Phineas was aware of the war's progress, aware by the autumn of 1864 that the Confederate cause was going badly, that Sherman was moving through Georgia, that the end was not yet visible, but was perceptible in the way the end of a storm is perceptible before the last clouds clear. He wrote about this with a complicated mixture of emotions that he examined honestly. October 7th, 1864. News from Parthenia. The county is diminished. She does not say it in these words. She says only that the church congregation is smaller than it was, that several farms are being worked by women alone, that the road past the farm was used last week by a column of men going south who looked, she said, like they had come from somewhere they did not expect to be leaving. I hear in these reports the sound of an ending. I feel something when I hear this that I cannot simply call relief. The men who are suffering in those columns are not men I was ordered to kill. They are men I knew, in some cases, men whose families I have farmed beside, men whose choices were not my choices, but whose suffering is not abstract to me. I deserted because I believed the cause unjust. I still believe this. But I also believe that what I believe does not protect other men from pain, and the knowledge of that is its own kind of wound. He did not write often about the cause itself. The war's politics, the arguments about secession and slavery and constitutional authority that had filled the newspapers of 1861. When he did, he was direct and not rhetorical, making the case in the manner of a man reasoning in private rather than arguing in public. February 12th, 1864. It is Lincoln's birthday, which I note because I have thought about Lincoln more than once in this past year. A man in Georgia in the autumn of 1862, lying in a tent on ground that was cold and wet in equal measure, will think about large things. I thought about why we were there. I had, when I enlisted, the motives of my neighbors, the obligation of community, the pressure of expectation, the genuine belief, not well examined, that the cause had something to do with liberty in the large sense. A year of the Army examined these beliefs for me, with the thoroughness that only proximity to their consequences can achieve. Men were dying for the right of some men to own other men. This is the simple version of what I concluded, and I believe It is the true version, even if it is not the complete version. I enlisted for community. I deserted for conscience. I am aware of the cost of the second. I no longer believe it to have been wrong. Ezra read that entry twice, and then sat with it for a while, in the sealed room. He was of a generation that had grown up with the war as history rather than experience, and the history he had absorbed in the way that history is absorbed in the South in those decades had been a selective one. One in which the questions Phineas posed so directly had been smoothed over or reframed, or simply not asked in polite company. Western North Carolina was different from the rest of the Confederate South in this respect. The mountains had been divided. The Unionist sentiment had been real and widespread. And the history of desertion in these counties was not a shameful secret, so much as a well-known and rarely discussed fact. But even here, the directness of his grandfather's words, "Men were dying for the right of some men to own other men," landed with a weight that required sitting with. He thought about what it meant that his mother had kept this diary sealed in a cabin for 40 years. He thought about whether she had read it, and he thought she must have. How could she have maintained the cabin without reading what it contained, without understanding what she was maintaining? He thought about what it had been like for her to carry that understanding, sealed as tightly as the cabin itself, for 4 decades, while the county rebuilt itself around a version of the war that would not have welcomed Phineas Graybeale's entries in the county history. He thought she was protecting more than one thing. She was protecting his life initially, his freedom, his safety in those first years when deserters were still being hunted and executed. She was protecting his name after the war, when the shame of desertion would have clung to the family regardless of the cause's justice, because history is written by the living, and the living have their arrangements. But she was also, Ezra now thought, protecting something rarer and harder to name: his meaning. The record of a man who had thought about what he was doing and why, and had said so clearly, and whose clarity was preserved in a room sealed against the distortions that time and community and grief would have imposed if it had been public. He closed the diary temporarily. He was not done with it. There was much he had not yet read, and went into the workshop, and then to the back of the workshop, where the light from the lantern found a wall that seemed, on examination, slightly wrong. The back wall of the workshop was built of the same chestnut logs as the rest of the cabin, but there was something about the proportions that had bothered Ezra without his being able to name it. He stood in front of the wall for a long moment, then paced the workshop and paced the main room, counting his steps, and confirmed what he had half suspected. The workshop was shorter, by perhaps 4 feet, than the exterior of the cabin would suggest. 4 feet somewhere in the back wall had been enclosed. He ran his hands along the logs, feeling the chinking, checking for joints that did not belong. It took him perhaps 15 minutes. Phineas had been careful, and the concealment was good, before he found it. A section of wall that was not logs at all, but a very convincing approximation of logs. The facing board shaped to mimic the rounded profile of the chestnut timbers, and stained to match their color. He pressed at the center of the section, and heard a click, and the whole assembly swung inward on a pivot mounted at the center of the panel, revealing the hidden room behind. The room was narrow, 4 feet deep, the full width of the cabin about 12 feet, and had been designed not for habitation, but for concealment and storage. There was no furniture in it. There was no window. The lantern threw his shadow tall against the far wall and illuminated, in the 3 years' worth of items stored here, the most private inventory of the man who had made everything else. The Confederate uniform was first. It hung on a wooden peg, folded rather than hung. Jacket and trousers separated and stacked, the gray wool moth-eaten now, but the shape still recognizable, the buttons still polished. He would not have needed to keep it, Ezra thought. He could have burned it. Should have burned it, practically speaking, since it was evidence. That he had kept it, folded carefully and stored in a hidden room, said something about the relationship between a man and the thing he has refused. He had not wanted to destroy it. He had wanted to put it where it could not be seen. Beside the uniform, a letter, a single page, folded in thirds, the ink brown with age, but fully legible, addressed in Phineas's hand to the commander of the Army of Tennessee. Ezra read it in the lamplight of the hidden room. To whom it may command. I write to explain my absence from the ranks of the Army of Tennessee, which has been a deliberate absence since the 9th of November, 1863, and which I do not intend to reverse. I understand that this letter will not be received as an adequate justification for what the law considers a capital crime. I write it not to justify myself to the law, but to justify myself to myself, which is the only court I believe has jurisdiction over a man's conscience, however much the law may contest this view. I am a man of Ashe County, North Carolina. I enlisted in the summer of 1862 from a complex of motives that I have since examined and found to be insufficient to sustain my continued service. I do not believe the Confederate cause to be just. I do not believe that the institution of human slavery, which the Confederacy was constituted to protect and perpetuate, can be defended on any moral ground that a Christian man can stand on. I believed, when I enlisted, that these questions were separate from my duty to community and family. I no longer believe they can be separated. A man who fights for a cause he believes unjust has made a choice about the relative weight of community obligation and personal conscience, and he has chosen the community. I am unable to continue making this choice. I am aware that the community will suffer the consequences of my refusal. I am aware that my family will suffer. I am aware that my conscience is a luxury that others cannot afford. I offer no defense of this luxury, except to say that it is the only thing I own outright, and I am not willing to surrender it, and that, if I am wrong about this, I would rather be wrong in accordance with my own best judgment than right in accordance with instructions I believe to be morally bankrupt. I wish the men of the Army no harm. I wish the cause no success. I remain in the mountains, Phineas Graybeal, formerly private, Company C, 37th Regiment, North Carolina Troops. He had never sent it. He had written it and put it in the hidden room, and it had stayed there for 40 years while the war ended, and the Confederacy failed, and the cause he had refused to fight for was defeated by the armies he had not joined. The letter served no practical purpose. It could not have been sent, really, without revealing his location, and it would not have been received as anything other than evidence for a court-martial. But he had written it, and that meant something. It meant that he had wanted to be on record, somewhere, even if only in a room sealed against the world. Even a hidden record is a record. Beneath the letter, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine that had dried and stiffened over the decades. Ezra untied the knot carefully. The twine was fragile, and spread the bundle on the floor of the hidden room. He counted 23 letters, all in his mother's handwriting, all dated between November 1863 and April 1865. He did not read them immediately. He sat cross-legged on the floor of the narrow hidden room with the letters in his lap and the lantern beside him, and allowed himself a moment that he could not have named if asked. Something between grief and gratitude, something that had no word in English, and perhaps no word in any language. The feeling of holding in your hands the physical evidence of a love that was never supposed to be found. He picked up the first letter, dated November 16th, 1863, 2 days after Phineas's first diary entry. Finn, I have your letter. I have burned it as you asked. I have not slept since reading it except for 1 hour this morning before the children woke, which was enough sleep to make me functional and not enough to make me write. I am not angry with you. I want you to know this first, before anything else. I am not angry with you for coming back, and I am not angry with you for asking what you have asked. I think about what I know of you, all of it, the years of it, and I know you would not have done this if you could see another way. I trust this about you, even though I cannot see the other way myself from where I am standing. What I want to say to you now is practical, and what I want to say to you emotionally, I will say at the end. Practical. I can bring supplies. I know how to move at night. I have done it before for different reasons, and I know the paths. No one watches the ridge paths at night. I can bring flour, salt, dried meat, candles. I can bring them every 2 weeks if the weather allows, more often in good weather. I will. The children will not notice my absence at night if I am careful. Marcus is 4 and sleeps like the dead, and Louisa is 6 and sleeps nearly as well. I will be careful. What I want to say to you emotionally, I love you, and I'm afraid for you, and I believe you are doing what is right, even though I wish you had found a different right thing to do that did not require me to tell people you are dead. I will tell them. I will do what must be done. I am your wife, and that means I'm also your conscience's keeper when your conscience puts you beyond the reach of everything else. Come to no harm. Eat what I bring. Carve things. Write things. Come back to me when you can. P. Ezra sat with that letter for a long time. He thought about his mother as he had known her, as the woman who had raised him, who had run the farm after his father died in 1878, who had been the fixed point of his childhood and young manhood, the person whose authority over the family was total and unquestioned, not because she demanded authority, but because she possessed it, the way a mountain possesses altitude. He had known her as a practical woman, an intelligent woman, a woman who read and thought and was not given to sentiment, who kept the family Bible updated and the farm accounts in a ledger she reviewed every Sunday evening after church. He had known her as a widow. His father was the only husband he had evidence of, and he had always thought of his mother as a woman whose marriage was one chapter. In a longer life, she had mostly lived alone. He understood now that this was wrong, in a way that made him sit in the narrow hidden room and stare at the lantern until his eyes adjusted. His mother had been married, deeply, thoroughly, privately married, for 40 years to a man who was not present. She had maintained his home, his secret, his cabin, his name, in the family Bible. Killed in action, Chickamauga, September 1863. A lie she had written herself, across 4 decades of mountain life, raising children, working land, going to church, attending community gatherings, and carrying in her chest a knowledge that she shared with no one, and that defined the shape of everything she did. Her entire public life, the life Ezra had known as his mother's life, had been organized around the maintenance of a secret that was also, he now understood, a love story. She had built her public existence as a structure inside which the private existence, the letters, the night visits, the yearly replacement of the boards on the sealed cabin, could continue unobserved. He read through the bundle of letters in order, and as the morning light shifted outside, it was past noon now, he realized, hearing the distant sound of the dinner bell from the farmhouse below. The correspondence assembled itself into something that was, he thought, one of the more extraordinary human documents he had encountered. His mother was not a literary woman in the formal sense, but she wrote with the precision and economy of someone who understood that every word she put on paper was a word that had to be carried by night through the woods and delivered through a crack in a boarded door, and who therefore chose each word with the care of a jeweler setting a stone. January 1864. I talked to the preacher today about you. I did not say it was about you. I asked him what the Bible says about men who refuse to fight. He said the Bible has a complicated relationship with war, and that a man's conscience before God is between him and God. I said, and if the community judges differently than God? He said, the community is not God, though it sometimes acts as though it believes otherwise. He is a wise man. I thought you should know that there are wise men in this county who would have understood you. I did not tell him. I will not tell him. But I thought you should know. March 1864. The Henderson's boy came home from the army. He lost a hand at Missionary Ridge. He does not talk about it. His mother told me that she is glad he is home and alive even without the hand. I could not tell her what I was thinking, which is that you are home and alive and whole. And the reason I can say this and she cannot is the reason you made the choice you made. I wonder if you know this. I think you do. But I want to say it. You did the right thing. I believed it in November. And I believed it in that awful February. And I believe it now in March, when the mud is just beginning to ease up, and the ridge is making its sounds again. And I believe it more specifically, because I have watched Margaret Henderson's face when her son's empty sleeve moves, and I know that my face does not look like that, and the reason it does not is you. Come home if you can. Not yet, but when you can. June 1864. I found one of Marcus's drawings today on the back of an old deed. He drew our family, himself, Louisa, me, and 4 figures standing a little apart. I asked him who the 4th figure was. He said, Papa. He is 4 years old, and he remembers you from when he was 2. I do not know what to do with this. I told him you were in heaven. He said, Oh. He was quiet for a moment and then said, I thought he was in the woods. I said, Why would you think that? He said, Because I saw a light up on the ridge at night. I said, That is the moon sometimes catching the windows. He accepted this. He is 4. But I thought you should know that your son sees you in the darkness, even when he does not have the words for it. He is a smart boy. He will be a smart man. I wish you could see him. That letter, the one about Marcus seeing a light on the ridge at night, seeing his father in the darkness without knowing it, was the one that broke something in Ezra's composure. Marcus was Ezra's father, dead for 27 years, who had grown up believing that his own father was a casualty of a battle in Georgia, who had worked this land and raised this family and gone to church and put flowers on a grave that held no one, who had looked up at the ridge cabin as a child and seen a light he interpreted as the moon, and who had been, for a brief, clear moment, right? He had seen his father, and his father had seen nothing, boarded in, but had perhaps seen in his mind's eye his son looking up at the ridge in the dark, and had made of that imagining a carving, or a night of careful writing, or an hour of shaping a chair, so beautiful it did not need an audience. Ezra found, among the remaining letters, the one he was now expecting to find. The letter from April 1865, the last one in the bundle, dated the same week as Phineas's final diary entries. Finn, I know the war is over. I know you know it too. I have not come to the cabin because I wanted to give you time with this, to sit with what it means, to decide what you want to do without me in the room making it harder. I know you. I know that you will be gentle about how you leave, and I know you will leave because the man you have been for 2 years in that cabin is not the man who was living in this farmhouse in 1862, and I do not think that man can come back to the life that was his before, and I do not think you believe he can either. I am not saying this as a reproach. I am saying it as a woman who has had a great deal of time to think, and who has used that time for the purpose intended. Here's what I want you to know. If you leave, I will understand. If you cannot come back to this life, I will understand. But I want you to know that I will keep your cabin. I will keep your things in it. I will seal the door and maintain the seal, and no one will go in, and everything you made will be exactly where you left it for as long as I am alive. And after I am alive, I will tell whoever is next what they need to know, which is this: do not throw away what is in that cabin. It is the life of a good man, a man who thought and made and loved and refused, and whose refusal cost him everything and was still right. A man who deserves to be known. Your boys will know you eventually. I will make sure of it. Not now. Not while the county is what it is. Not while the shame of it would fall on them, and not on the cause that deserved it. But eventually, do what you must. I love you. Whatever name you use when you are gone, I love you in it. P. He did not return. The diary's final entries were dated across the first 2 weeks of April 1865. Lee surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th. The news would have reached Ashe County within days, filtering up through the valleys and along the river roads that connected the mountain communities to the wider world. Phineas's entry for April 12th, 2 days after the news would have arrived, was the longest in the journal. The war is over. I can leave, but I find I do not know how. I have been dead for 2 years. The man who walked into this cabin is not the man who sits here now. I have thought about this difference carefully. It seems important to understand it before I decide what to do with it. The man who walked in was a farmer, who had been a soldier, who had been a farmer. a man of community, a man whose identity was composed almost entirely of his relationships to other people: husband, father, neighbor, church member, countryman. I stripped all of those away in November of 1863, or they were stripped from me, and what was left was something I had not previously known was there. A man alone, with his tools and his books and his thinking. A man who made things for no one and thought things in private, and who has, over 2 years, developed an interior life so different from his prior existence that he cannot imagine overlaying it with the old one. I do not think I can be Phineas Graybeale again. Not because the name is dangerous. It is less dangerous now, with the war over. Though the stigma of desertion will outlast the legal threat for years, but because the person who answered to that name is not the person sitting at this desk. I am someone else. I became someone else in this room. The question is who? April 15th, 1865. I have decided. I will walk north, to Pennsylvania first, then perhaps further west if Pennsylvania does not suit. I will not take the rifle. I will not take the carvings. I will not take the furniture. I will take the clothes I arrived in, the money I have from what Parthenia brought over 2 years. She would accept none of it back, and whatever a man can carry who means to begin again from nothing. I will leave this diary on the desk, open to this page, so that whoever finds it, and I believe someone will find it eventually, nothing stays hidden forever, and Parthenia is not an unkind woman. She will not let this room disappear without explanation. Can read it and know what happened here. I am leaving this cabin and everything in it. I am leaving this name. Parthenia will know I am alive because this diary exists, and I will take nothing. A man who takes nothing is a man who means to return. I mean to return. Whether I will is another question. And then one final entry, apparently written the morning of his departure. The handwriting slightly different, quicker, more pressured, as though the hand had already half left the room. April 16th, 1865. It is morning. The birds are very loud. I have not listened properly to birds in a long time. You stop noticing them after a while, and then one morning, you notice them again, and you cannot account for the gap. I have put the uniform in the back room with the letter I never sent. I have put Parthenia's letters with them. These things deserve to be kept together. They are the record of a marriage that the world does not know happened, and the world is wrong not to know. I have eaten the last of the salt pork. I have left the plate and the cup on the table because I may come back, and I want there to be something waiting. I am wearing my coat. The door is in front of me. I do not know what is outside it. The same mountain, presumably. The same county. The same river running north in the valley below. The oldest river in North America running in the wrong direction for reasons it has never explained, and for which I have always felt a particular sympathy. A river that goes north instead of south has refused the expected course. It is still a river. It reaches the water it is going to reach. It just takes the longer way. I am opening the door. Good morning. Ezra closed the diary. He sat at the table for a long time, without moving. The November light through the open door had shifted while he was reading. It was late afternoon now, the sun already dropping toward the western ridge, the light the color of old brass. He was cold. He had been cold for hours and had not noticed. he now noticed. He thought about the door, standing open since morning, the first time it had been open in 40 years, letting the cold November air in and taking the preserved air out, the air of 1865 that had been sealed in this room since the morning. A man said good morning to his diary and walked out forever. He thought about the plate on the table, waiting 40 years for someone to return and eat from it. He thought about the chair facing the boarded east window, waiting. He thought about the diary, open on the desk when the door was finally opened, waiting. Everything in this room had been waiting. Everything in this room had been kept. He went to the workshop and picked up the small sycamore carving of his grandmother's face and held it in his hand as he walked back through the main room. He stopped at the door. At the threshold of the open door, where the cold outside air met the preserved air within, and looked back at the room one more time. The plate, the cup, the chair facing the east window, the books on the shelf, the rifle above the door, the desk with the diary. All of it in the last light of the November afternoon, still and exact and patient, exactly as a man had left it on a morning in April 1865 when the birds were very loud and the door was in front of him, and he said good morning to everything he was leaving behind. Ezra stepped back inside. He lifted the lantern from the table and set it carefully to one side. He pulled the chair out, sat down, and opened the diary again. Not to read, he had read it, just to sit with it, in the room it belonged to, in the last of the light. He did this for perhaps an hour, until Clara's voice came up the ridge calling him to supper. And then he closed the diary, set it back on the desk, and walked to the door. He did not board it up again that night. He left the door open to the November air, the first open door the cabin had known in 40 years, and walked down the path to the farmhouse with the sycamore carving in his coat pocket. In the weeks that followed, Ezra made the inventory that anyone who cares about such things makes when they have discovered that they are the custodian of something irreplaceable. He cataloged the carvings, 47 in total, and the furniture and the tools and the books with their annotations. He photographed the hidden room with its folded uniform and its bundled letters. He transcribed the diary, sitting at the table in the sealed room with the lantern and his own journal, copying every entry in his careful hand so that there would be a second copy if the original deteriorated. The original diary he left on the desk where Phineas had left it, open to the last entry, the way a man leaves a book he means to come back to. He wrote to the County Historical Society, though he was not yet ready to share everything. He wrote to a veterans organization in Raleigh, asking for records of Company C, 37th North Carolina, looking for the name Phineas Graybeale in the rolls of the missing. He found it. Phineas Graybeale, missing in action following the engagement at Missionary Ridge, November 1863, presumed dead. He wrote to census offices in Pennsylvania and Ohio, tracking a name that he expected would not be there and another name that he suspected might be. The search took 3 years. He found in the Stark County, Ohio census for 1870, a man named Finn Gray, listed as a woodworker, age approximately 40, birthplace listed as Carolina. In the 1880 census, the same man, now 50, still in Stark County, still a woodworker, still unmarried. A neighbor, interviewed years later by a local historian who had no idea he was touching something, remembered Finn Gray as a quiet man, exceptional with wood. Everyone wanted a piece of his furniture, but he didn't take many commissions. Seemed to prefer working for himself. A furniture maker in Canton, Ohio, who had apprenticed briefly under an older craftsman, told the same historian that his teacher had come from somewhere in the mountains and never would say where exactly, would kind of smile when you asked and say he was from before. Finn Gray died in Stark County in 1891, age listed as approximately 60, which aligned with Phineas Gray Beale's birth year of 1831. He left no family, no will, no recorded property except his tools and his workshop contents, which were dispersed by the county. A neighbor who helped sort through the workshop told the local historical record that among Finn Gray's possessions was a small carved figure, a woman's face in pale wood, that no one could identify, and that the neighbor kept because it seemed too fine to throw away. In 1908, Ezra Graybeale wrote to the Stark County Historical Society, enclosing a photograph of Parthenia Graybeale's daguerreotype from around 1860. He wrote, "I believe I am looking for a carving of this woman's face, in pale wood, possibly sycamore, possibly made between 1863 and 1865. If you have such an item in your possession, or know of its whereabouts, I would be grateful to hear from you." The Stark County Historical Society wrote back in 1909. The carving had been donated to their collection by the neighbor's estate. They described it as a woman's face in sycamore wood, approximately the size of a hand. The workmanship, exceptional. They enclosed a photograph. Ezra received the photograph on a February morning in 1909 and sat with it at the kitchen table until Clara came in and found him there and asked what was wrong. He showed her the photograph of the carving. She looked at it for a long moment. "That's your grandmother," she said. "Yes," Ezra said. "He made 2 of them," Clara said. "Yes," Ezra said. He wrote back to Stark County and arranged for the carving to be transferred to the Ashe County Historical Society, with which he had been working for several years to preserve what was in the cabin on Graybeale Ridge. The transfer was completed in 1910. The carving, the diary, and Parthenia's letters, which Ezra had kept in the hidden room until then, unwilling to disturb the arrangement Phineas had made for them, were formally accessioned by the Historical Society that same year. Ezra went back to the cabin on the day he brought the diary and letters down from the ridge. He stood in the main room for the last time as its sole custodian, because after today, it would belong to the county's history in a formal way that he could not undo, and looked at what remained. The tools, the furniture, the 47 carvings, the shelf of books with their annotations, the plate and cup on the table, the rifle above the door. He had preserved everything as he found it. He had kept the room exactly as Phineas had left it, minus the diary and the letters, which now lived behind glass in a building in Jefferson, where people could read them without cold hands. He stood in the room and thought about the sentence his mother had said to him on her deathbed. "Your grandfather is not in the grave we visit. Open the cabin, and you will understand." He understood now what she meant. He understood that the grave in the churchyard, with Phineas Graybeale's name on it, and the dates, and the notation, "Killed in service," was a lie she had maintained for 40 years, and that the lie was not a failure of truth, but a form of protection, a sealed room of its own, keeping safe something inside, that was not ready to be seen. He understood that the cabin on the ridge was the true grave, in the sense that it contained everything that made a man a man. His thought, his work, his love, his moral reasoning, his handwriting, his hands, everything except his body. He understood that his mother had been the keeper of both, the false and the true, and had managed this for 4 decades with a composure and a discipline that he was only now capable of fully appreciating, because he was only now standing in the room. That was the reason for all of it. He thought about Phineas walking out the door on an April morning in 1865, saying good morning to the birds and the mountain and the oldest river in North America. Walking north, becoming Finn Gray in Ohio, a man who worked with wood and did not speak of the past and kept a single carving in pale sycamore of a woman's face, never returning. Not because he could not, but because he had decided in that long thinking in the sealed room that the man who could return was not the same as the man who had left, and that returning under a name that no longer fit was its own kind of lie, different in character, but not in kind from the lie Parthenia had maintained in the churchyard. He thought, a man who goes north and becomes someone else is not necessarily a man who has abandoned the people he left. He might be a man who understood that some returns are only possible as departures, that the truest way back sometimes is to keep going until you are something the people you love would recognize as better, or at least as real. He did not know if he believed this. He thought his grandmother had believed it. He thought she had believed it every time she replaced the boards on the cabin door. Every time she told her children that their father had died at Chickamauga. Every time she looked at the ridge at night and saw no light, because the light was gone now. The man was in Ohio. The room was dark, and still maintained the seal, still kept the cabin whole, still kept faith with something that no longer had a living occupant, but was not, for that, empty. A room kept whole is a room that might be returned to. She had kept it whole for 40 years. She had been right to keep it. He was not right to think about this now. It was a Tuesday in 1908, and he was 44 years old, and there were fields to tend, and church business to attend to, and his daughter's husband was coming to supper. He set his hand on the back of the Windsor chair, the first chair, the one Phineas had made when he was still frightened, the one that faced the east window that was still boarded, and that had a crest rail carved with interlocking leaves that served no purpose except to exist, and stood there for a moment, feeling the wood under his palm, feeling through the wood the 40 years of someone else's hands on it, the grain of it, the quality of the work. Then he picked up the lantern and walked out of the cabin and down the path. He left the cabin open. The open door let in weather for several years, until the County Historical Society arranged a formal preservation effort in 1912, raised funds, brought in a craftsman, repaired the chinking in the roof, resealed the windows with materials that would last. The furniture was cataloged and remained in place. The carvings were moved to the Historical Society for safekeeping, except for the 47th and largest. The bear sitting upright with its expression of worried dignity, which Ezra had asked to be left on the windowsill in the workshop where Phineas had placed it, because it seemed wrong to move a thing that had been exactly where it was for 50 years, and had by staying become part of the room's argument. The Graybeal family added Phineas's name to the family Bible in 2005, 140 years after he walked out of the cabin. His entry reads, Phineas Graybeal, born 1831, believed dead 1863, departed 1865, found 1905. No death date is listed. Some Graybeals believe he is buried as Finn Gray in Stark County, Ohio, in a cemetery outside Canton, where a woodworker with no family and no history was interred in the spring of 1891. Others believe he kept walking, north, then west, into a life so thoroughly reinvented that it left no trail at all, becoming, in the end, something that no census could record, and no census would need to. A man who had made himself from the inside out in a sealed room in the Appalachian Mountains, and who carried that interior construction with him into the world and let it be his only architecture. The New River still runs north through Ashe County, still the oldest river in North America, still running in the direction that geologists have spent a century explaining, and that Phineas Graybeal, sitting in his sealed room in the winter of 1863, understood the way you understand something that has no explanation except itself. It runs north because it was here before the mountains that tried to tell it which way to go. It was here before the borders, before the county, before the cabin on the ridge, before the war that sent men south to die for a cause a man in a sealed room decided he could not serve. It will be here after the last Graybeal is in the ground, running north through its ancient valley, cutting the same channel it has been cutting for 265 million years, which is to say, for no reason, except that the way was there, and it took it. The cabin on Graybeal Ridge still stands. Ezra preserved it as he found it. A museum of 2 years no one was supposed to know about, kept whole by a woman who believed that some secrets deserve to be maintained until they are ready to be found. The diary is now held by the Ashe County Historical Society in a temperature-controlled room behind glass, open to the last page where Phineas wrote "Good morning" and walked out the door. Parthenia's letters are beside it, tied with new twine, the original having crumbled when the Historical Society took them in, but the handwriting still clear, and the voice in it still precise, and still practical, and still, after 140 years, the voice of a woman who understood that protecting someone's choice is the deepest form of love available. The uniform is in storage. The letter to the commander of the Army of Tennessee is framed beside it with a note that reads, "In a historical society, curator's careful script, never sent." The shelf of books, the annotated Emerson with its 3 marginal words, "He knows us," is in the collection and can be examined by appointment. The rifle above the door remains in the cabin, on its pegs, still loaded, still clean, still pointing at the closed door that the man it belonged to left open behind him on the morning of April 16th, 1865. The carving of the woman's face, found among Finn Gray's possessions in Stark County, Ohio, acquired by the Ashe County Historical Society in 2010, sits in a glass case beside Phineas's diary, beside Parthenia's letters, beside the uniform that was never worn again. Together, they tell the story of a man who left everything to keep his conscience, and a woman who kept everything to protect his name. Together, they are the record of a marriage that the world was not supposed to know about, conducted for 2 years, through a boarded door, and maintained for 40 more in the form of a sealed cabin on a ridge above the oldest river in North America. A river that goes north instead of south, for reasons it is never explained, which is its own kind of answer to the people who stand on its banks and ask it why. Some things do not explain themselves. Some things just go.